Welcome back. In this video we're talking about 10 things that are mostly not spoken about, sewing secrets if you will, and if you understand them they're going to increase your confidence and your ability to sew. So let's get straight into them. So a sewing pattern is not a bespoke pattern for your specific body. It is a template used by many. So when we get into sewing, we develop this idea that sewing patterns are made for our bodies. So all we have to do is purchase the pattern, trace it off or cut it out, cut the fabric out, make the thing, and it'll fit us perfectly. And it's just not true. There is such an expectation that a pattern will fit us, and we think that if a pattern doesn't fit us well, then there's something wrong with the pattern. But actually it's our mindsets that are wrong. So when a designer is designing a pattern, they will have a block which is a generic size based on generic measurements, and they will make it and then they will grade it up and down for different sizes based on that block. There is no way on this earth that a designer can make a garment specifically to fit you and you only, because they sell it to thousands of people. If you do purchase a pattern and you make it and it fits you out of the packet, consider that a miracle, because it's very, very rare and unlikely that that will happen. I think what we have to do is accept that alterations need to take place. So this is something that took me a long time to get to grips with. I would say for the first 3 years of sewing, I did not do alterations. I would make up a garment. If it didn't fit me, I'd move on to the next thing. A toile was something in the back of my brain. I'd heard of it, but I didn't really know what it was. But my sewing only improved once I understood that this is a template, not a pattern for me. Because when I understood that, I started to assess the pattern. I would measure the pattern pieces. I would make up a toile or a mock-up, and I'd make alterations based on that. These days, you've seen in my videos, I make 1, 2, 3, 4 in the case of my most recent make to get to the perfect make. I will say that if you find a pattern company that largely fits you and you don't need too many alterations, stick with that pattern company, because they use the same block in each pattern. Or better still, learn to draft your own patterns. So the next secret to share with you is that even the professionals unpick their sewing. So we seem to get it into our head when we first learn to sew that we make mistakes because we're a beginner, we're a novice, we don't know what we're doing, and we expect that as we get better, as we grow in confidence, then we will need to unpick our sewing less and less. Now, nothing could be further from the truth. Okay, there may be a tiny bit of truth in that. As we grow in confidence and experience, we will make less mistakes, precisely because we have more confidence in what we're doing. However, it's a complete lie we tell ourselves that we are never going to have to use the unpicker again once we know what we're doing. So if you don't know, if you're brand new to sewing and you don't know, an unpicker is a little tool that we use to unpick stitches that we've sewn, and we need to unpick it basically in order to sew it again. So in a way, that isn't necessarily inexperience. Yes, experience is going to help you sew the right line of stitching, but mistakes happen to the best of us. Even those Savile Row and wherever else in the world that produce professional garments professionally, as a professional, will still have an unpicker and still have to unpick seams. I know when I make a mistake, I'm in the habit of telling myself off for making that mistake, but actually we should be going a bit easier on ourselves, because everyone, no matter their skill level, will make mistakes. So the next sewing secret is that a serger will actually make your life easier. Yes, stay with that for just a moment. A serger will make your life easier. For some reason, we all have this fear of a serger. I include myself in that when I first got started. I think when we first get started, We use a sewing machine, and that's hard enough to get to grips with. Who took forever to learn to sew a straight line? I know I did. And then you go to add in a serger, and oh my goodness, it seems so much harder to learn. I've known people who have not got the serger out of the box. They've gone ahead and paid hundreds of pounds or dollars for this serger and then left it in the box. Let me know in the comments down below if you're one of those people. But I've known people who've done that, and it's just sat in the corner for years and years until they saw someone else using it and they got the motivation to try it. And what do they say once they do actually try it? I should have done this years ago, because it is so easy to use. I really don't understand what it is about sergers, but I include myself in that, because when I first got my first serger, I was scared of it. I think maybe because it's got multiple needles, it sounds really loud. We have to thread it with 3 or 4 threads. There's a whole spaghetti junction to get the threads through the machine, especially if you buy a low-end machine, which I imagine you would do as your first serger. So it can be really, really intimidating. But I promise you, if you've got a serger sitting there that you haven't used, or you're on the fence about buying one because you're intimidated by it, I can tell you a serger is going to make your life much, much easier. It's traditionally used for stretchy fabrics, and it's brilliant for that. But I also use mine for woven fabrics. I use it for finishing the seams. I use my main sewing machine to do a straight line, and then I whiz it through the overlocker in order to finish the seam, because it cuts off the edge of the fabric. It does a stitch that wraps around the edge. Your sewing's much less likely to come apart if you use this, and it's a lot quicker than a sewing machine as well. And if you really don't like the threads, then you can keep the same colour threads in the machine, or you can do that little hack where you tie your threads, the old thread and the new thread, into a knot and bring it through the machine. Just remember to turn your tension off while you do that. Bob's your uncle. You've got a machine that's just made your sewing much, much easier. The next tip or sewing secret to share with you is, and I'm going to get some hate for this one, I know I am, but it's true, you don't need to change your needle for every project. So there's this advice that goes around social media, on YouTube and Instagram and anywhere else that people are these days. They say make sure you've got a fresh needle for every project. Now, I'm sorry, but number one, that's a privileged position to be in, because I, for one, cannot afford to buy new needles for every single project when the old needles work just as well. Number two, it's wasteful. It's really wasteful to be constantly putting new needles in your machine. From my own personal experience, I've been sewing for 10 years or more, and I have always kept the same sewing machine needles in my machine, and I have just changed it when there's a problem, and nothing bad has happened. In my second serger, I think I changed the needles once in 3 years. They just did not get changed. No one's talking about it, but don't feel a need to change your needles. One thing I will say is buy good quality needles. If you do that, you'll need to change them less often. So the next one is, if you learn to master zips and buttonholes before you even start sewing garments, it will set you up for the rest of your sewing career. So something I hear from people quite a lot is they're scared of zippers and buttonholes as well. And I never really had that fear. I did develop a fear of buttonholes for a while, because the machine that I was using always messed them up, and it drove me crazy. But zippers in particular, I never actually had a fear of. And that's because before I was sewing clothes, I was sewing boxy pouches. I remember the late Melanie Ham had a video with some boxy pouches, and I made loads of them up. I made pillowcases with zips in the back. The very first zipper I put in a skirt did not go well, but I did not let it deter me. I practiced and practiced on the pouches, on the pencil case, on the bags, on the pillowcases. I practice. So when it came to making clothes, certainly after the first year or so of making clothes, I could sew zips with my eyes closed. And I know people after 6 or 7 years of sewing will avoid those things, and it's completely unnecessary. So if you're brand new and you haven't started sewing clothes yet, try making a pencil case, try making a pouch, a pillowcase, something like that that requires a zip, and it will give you the practice that you need. If you're someone who's still sewing but is scared of zips and buttonholes, then practice. Get some scrap fabric, some old zips, and make some zippers and some buttonholes. And always, certainly, when you're making buttonholes on a garment, take some fabric and some interfacing, exactly what you're using in your garment, and make a practice run before you do the actual buttonhole, and that will reduce your anxiety and any mistakes. So I'm trying to get my fabric stash in the shop for this one. So this next secret to sewing is you do not need to buy a lifetime supply of fabric, notions and patterns before you've even sewn your first garment. Yes, maybe that's a slight exaggeration, but you know where I'm coming from with this. We've all done it. I've been talking about it non-stop since I come back to the channel. When we begin sewing clothes, we fall in love with the practice of sewing, but at that same time we fall in love with finding fabrics and patterns, and it's a second hobby. We've seen the memes that say sewing and fabric collecting are two separate hobbies, and it's so true. But I will urge you, if you're pretty new to sewing, do not fall into the trap of buying all the pretty fabrics, because it is just not worth it. It's a waste of money, because what will happen is you'll put it in a cubby hole like I have, and either forget about it or not get around to sewing it for a long time. And by the time you do get around to sewing it, you're going to have fallen out of love with that fabric, and you'll end up donating it, or it'll just sit in your piles for years and years. One of my viewers said that they had a fabric from, I think it was 1969, that they still haven't sewn up. Don't waste your money. Keep your money in the bank account, and then when you do want to buy some fabric for a project, you've got that money there and you can purchase the exact fabric that you want at the moment that you are doing your project. Can sew with minimum supplies. You can use old bed sheets to practice clothes, or you can go to the charity shop and buy fabric. You could even buy fabric in the shop. No one's saying you can't, but just don't buy excess amounts of it. Buy what you need for a project by project basis, and that will make your sewing life a lot simpler, a lot less stressful, and it's something no one's really talking about. So the next tip for you is that patterns are slightly altered blocks. So I talked about earlier how patterns are not bespoke patterns, they are templates. Well, those templates are actually just taken from the block and altered slightly for each different pattern. Look through the same pattern designers' patterns, and you will see that sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes their patterns are altered only very minimally and then sold as different patterns. Well, once you've purchased one of those patterns from a company, you can alter it. When they release new patterns, you can alter it and make that new pattern yourself without paying again and again for these very expensive patterns. Now, to be honest, when we're brand new to sewing, the idea of pattern drafting is really out of this world, isn't it? I know when I first started to sew and I tried to alter the patterns, it was a minefield, and often I would get it wrong. I remember there was this one pattern from Colette that I bought. I think it was called the Rue dress, and I was altering it, trying to get it to fit me. I couldn't, and I gave up, and I nearly gave up on sewing. So it's really important you only take this advice of adapting patterns yourself if you know what you're doing. But anyone can learn this stuff. There's so many resources online. In the end, it turned out that Rue dress was really badly drafted, and the company did release an apology later on and they redrafted it. But I nearly gave up sewing over that because my head was a mumble with not knowing what to do. The good news is, the more I tried to make these changes, the more I made the adjustments, the more I was able to get better and make patterns fit me more snugly. So the next sewing secret I have for you is that you can get more out of your fabric by not following the layout plans in the patterns. So when you get a pattern, you will look through the instructions. It will tell you about sizing, full bust adjustments, the amount of fabric you need, and then you'll get to the fabric layout. So it will give you a prescribed layout depending on how wide your fabric is. And if you are brand new to sewing, this can be really helpful in the early days. But once you've made a couple of patterns, it's really important that you understand that this is just one layout. Often the layouts are on the fold, so they fold the fabric in half. However, if you are to lay your fabric out flat and cut it that way, so say for your arm pieces, you'd have to cut them twice, mirrored, but you can do that and you can save quite a lot of fabric doing that. Now for me, I don't follow them, but I don't make the most of my fabric. Whatever you do, just think about the layout that they're giving you and ask yourself, is this the best use of my fabric? The next tip I have for you, and there isn't a pattern, an idea, a project that you cannot do. You might be new to sewing and feel like you can barely sew a straight line, so you're not going to be able to sew a coat with welt pockets and lapels and God knows what else. There's two things to keep in mind here. Number one is any pattern or any garment that you're going to make is a step-by-step process. So it's one step after the other. And if you come across steps that you haven't made before, you can practice those steps on a toile, on a scrap piece of paper, until you get them right. If you're someone who has been sticking to specific patterns, maybe a simple dress, because you feel you're new and you're not experienced enough, for the next project, I challenge you to put yourself out of your comfort zone. The sewing secret that I have for you that I saved to last is to utilise sewing tools in a way that is going to work for you. So on social media, there are two camps. There's either I've got to have every sewing tool in the world, and that was me when I started, or you don't need any of these sewing tools and you can make do with a pair of scissors, thread and a sewing machine. Well, I sit somewhere in the middle. While I believe that we don't need all the sewing tools, I believe there are some that are really helpful to us and will really escalate our sewing, increase our sewing skills and make sewing much easier. But it's all about knowing, getting to know through the experience what works for you, because what works for you is going to be different to what works for the next person. Check out this video here where I talked about the sewing tools that work for me and have worked for me for the last 10 years.